It had been a while since I truly looked at him. I could tell he hadn't noticed the shift in me. At least, not yet. He was still the same man I had married. Still the one who always arrived home at the same time with that familiar worn-out briefcase in hand. The one who would sit at the dinner table and ask about my day, about how things were going, as if the question were a routine he'd memorized years ago. We had our routines, our little lives that played out in sync without ever needing to say much. The silence wasn't something that struck me at first. It snuck up on me slowly, like fog creeping over a town, until I didn't mean to stop noticing him. I never thought I would, but somewhere along the way, I did. It wasn't that he had become a stranger, not in the traditional sense. He still wore the same cologne, still laughed at the same dumb jokes, still complained about the neighbor's dog. But there was something missing. It was as if we were both sitting in the same room, but I was no longer. I suppose that's how it started. I began to notice things, small things, insignificant things, that made me feel like I was walking beside him but not really with him. Like when he'd come home, and his tired smile no longer reached his eyes. Or how we would sit in front of the TV, both of us glued to our screens, and I'd feel an ache in my chest because the person sitting beside me felt like a memory, not a presence. We had built this life together, hadn't we? The house, the kitchen table where we'd shared so many quiet dinners, the bed we'd fallen asleep in countless times, all wrapped up in the comfort of routine. But somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had become two strangers sharing a space, pretending we were something more. And then the loneliness started to creep in, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't know what to do with it at first. The silence felt like something I should just push through, like an inconvenient passing storm. I told myself I would feel better once things calmed down. Once we had more time together, once we had the time to talk. It wasn't like we hadn't talked before, right? It wasn't like there was anything wrong. Or maybe that's what I wanted to believe. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was missing something. Missing him, the man I had married, the one I had once known so intimately. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that something was missing, something I couldn't quite put into words. I had once been certain that we would weather everything together, that this bond we had, the connection we had formed over years of laughter, tears, and memories, would hold us up no matter how much time passed. But somewhere between the ebb and flow of life, the world had shifted in ways I hadn't seen. And the more I tried to hold on to it, the more I felt it slipping through my fingers. That's when I met him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, I just stared at him across the table as he asked about my day, his voice a familiar sound that echoed in my ears like a memory. I gave him a smile, the kind of smile you give when you know that even though you're sitting next to someone, you're still somewhere else entirely. It started so innocently. At first, he was just another face, someone I crossed paths with now, and then a man I barely noticed in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But somehow, we ended up in the same space more often than I would have ever expected. He worked at the cafe I occasionally visited, the one I'd started going to on my own when I needed a change of scenery. At first, it was nothing more than casual small talk. A simple, "How's your day?" or "What can I get for you?" He always remembered my order, which I found strangely endearing. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, I was just a regular customer, and he was just the barista. I didn't come there expecting anything more than a warm cup of coffee and a moment to myself. But then, one day, he asked me something different. It was an offhand remark, something about the weather, and somehow we started talking about life, of all things. The conversation was easy, like talking to an old friend you hadn't seen in years. We shared a few laughs, exchanged fleeting details about our lives. Nothing too personal, nothing too deep. But it felt comfortable. It felt alive, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I told myself it was harmless. Just an innocent conversation between two strangers. Nothing more. But as the days went on, I found myself looking forward to seeing him. Each time I walked into that cafe, I'd find myself scanning the room, hoping to see him behind the counter, to hear his voice as he greeted me with that easy smile. He had a way of making me feel like I was the only one in the room, like the world had suddenly narrowed down to just the two of us. And somehow I began to want more of it. At first, I didn't recognize it for what it was. It was just a fleeting distraction, a change of pace, a little spark that lit up the dullness of my everyday life. But as the days turned into weeks, I could feel the weight of it in the air, heavy and unspoken. We didn't even talk about anything particularly important, but it was the way he looked at me, like I wasn't just a customer, like I wasn't just anyone. It made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. I could tell myself it wasn't a big deal, that it was just an innocent flirtation, a harmless friendship. But a part of me knew it wasn't, and that scared me. Each time we spoke, I felt this strange pull, like a quiet invitation to something that I wasn't sure I was ready for. But in the midst of it, I couldn't bring myself to turn away. I had never been someone who liked the idea of what-ifs. I was practical. I was a woman of structure, of boundaries. I told myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't seeking anything. But there were moments when our eyes would meet, and I could feel something stirring deep within me, something I didn't recognize. It felt like the beginning of something, even if I wasn't ready to admit it. I wanted to stop it, to pull myself back before things got too complicated. But every time I saw him, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. The pull was subtle, but strong enough to make me linger just a little longer. And so I kept going back, just for the coffee, just for the conversation, just for him. But I couldn't deny it anymore. He had become something more than just a stranger. It's strange how little moments can change everything. How a glance, a few words, a shared silence can suddenly feel like a door you never knew was there, just waiting to be opened. I don't remember the exact moment when I realized I was looking forward to our conversations, when I started to wait for them, crave them, as though they held some key to a part of me I hadn't recognized in years. One afternoon, I walked into the cafe like usual. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and I felt that familiar pull in my chest when I saw him behind the counter. There was something different about the way he looked at me today, something that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just a polite, casual smile. It was a smile that lingered, that seemed to say more than words could express. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as I approached the counter. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though the way my pulse quickened gave me away. "Hey," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The usual?" I nodded, but before I could say anything more, he surprised me. "How's your day been? You seemed a little quiet the last time you were here." His tone was gentle, almost as though he noticed more than just the surface. As if in that small moment he had actually seen me. It was strange. I had spent so long feeling invisible, like a background character in my own life. And here was this man, this stranger, noticing me in ways I hadn't expected. I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I didn't even know how my day had been. It had been the same as any other. But the weight of his question made something stir in me, something that had been dormant for too long. "It's been all right," I answered, my voice soft. "Just the usual stuff." He nodded thoughtfully as he prepared my coffee. "Sometimes it's the usual that gets to you, you know." He handed me the cup with a smile, and I realized in that moment how much I was not just a customer to him. I was something else, something more. "Yeah," I agreed, taking the cup from him. "I guess you're right." And then, before I knew it, we were talking again, more than we ever had before. We spoke about things we'd never touched on before, Things that were just a little more personal, a little more intimate. It felt easy, comfortable, like he wasn't a stranger at all. I shouldn't have been talking to him like this. I shouldn't have been letting myself slip into this false sense of closeness, this false sense of safety. It wasn't wrong, not yet, but I felt the stirring of something that was not so easily explained away. The way his eyes held mine, just a little longer than necessary, the way his voice softened. When he spoke to me, it was beginning to feel like something was starting to grow, something that I didn't know how to control. By the time I left the cafe, I had this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, something unsettled, something that told me I was dancing along the edge of something dangerous. But I couldn't help it. I didn't want to stop. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, caught between my husband and this stranger who was beginning to fill up the space between us. Uninvited. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Not really. But the more I thought about those moments with him, the more I found myself wanting to go back. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but his smile kept returning to me, his voice echoing in my mind. I had been so starved for attention, for someone to look at me and see me, that it was like a hunger I couldn't ignore anymore. As I walked into the house that evening, the sound of the front door closing behind me felt hollow. My husband was there, sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, the same routine we had fallen into. He looked up when I entered, but the smile he gave me didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the same smile I had come to expect, the polite, distant one. It wasn't his fault. He didn't know what was happening, what had begun to grow in the hidden corners of my mind. I kissed him lightly on the cheek, as I always did, but this time it felt different. I couldn't shake the thought of the cafe, of him, of the way he had made me feel in ways I hadn't felt in years. "How was your day?" my husband asked, his voice warm, but there was a question in his eyes I couldn't quite place. "It was fine," I said, my words sounding hollow even to myself. I couldn't bring myself to explain the rest. How could I? How could I say that my day had been fine? But there was something else in me now. A shift, a weight that hadn't been there before. I knew I wasn't being fair to him, that the distance between us was widening with every passing day. But how could I explain it to him? How could I explain the ache I felt when I was with him? The emptiness that seemed to grow more pronounced no matter how hard I tried to fill it. And yet, when I closed my eyes that night, I could only think of one thing: the quiet, knowing smile of the stranger who had begun to make the mundane feel alive again. The days blurred together in a haze of routine and conflict I didn't want to confront. There was something strange about the way I existed now, like I was torn between two versions of myself. One version was the woman I had been for years, the wife, the partner, the one who had shared laughter and love with a man who had once been my everything. The other version was someone new, someone who, for the first time in ages, felt alive in ways I hadn't realized I was missing. I kept telling myself that I should stop, that I should pull back, take a step away from it all, because the more I allowed myself to sink into these moments with him, the harder it would be to turn back. But every time I stepped into that cafe, every time our eyes met across the counter, it felt impossible to resist. I began finding excuses to go there more often. I needed coffee, I told myself. I needed to get away for a while, to breathe. I could feel the undercurrent of tension building inside me, coiling tight every time I thought about it, about him. I wasn't just visiting the cafe for the coffee anymore. I wasn't just going to escape the noise at home. I was going to see him. I was going to feel the spark that had ignited inside me, with every word he said, with every smile he offered. I didn't know how it had happened. I didn't know when I'd allowed myself to get lost in the idea of him, to let his presence in. But there was no denying it. I was drawn to him. And it wasn't just the way he looked at me or the way he listened, it was the way he made me feel. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I mattered. Not as a wife, not as someone's partner, but just as me, the woman, the person. It didn't take long for things to shift. The casual chats had started turning into longer, more meaningful conversations. We spoke about life, about dreams, about things that seemed trivial, but in that moment felt like revelations. I shared parts of myself with him that I hadn't shared in a long time, parts one didn't even know were still there. And he listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen. I tried to fight it. I tried to pull back, to tell myself it wasn't real, that this was just a phase. I had no right to allow myself to feel something I couldn't explain. He wasn't my husband. He wasn't the man I had committed myself to, the man who had been my partner, my love. But there was a pull, a quiet, undeniable force that kept drawing me back. It wasn't even that I was falling for him in the traditional sense, at least not yet. It was more like the idea of him, the feeling of someone who saw me as I wanted to be seen. Someone who didn't just ask how my day was, but wanted to know what had made it worthwhile, what had brought me joy, what had brought me pain. It had started with small glances, then evolved into private moments shared between us, those fleeting seconds that felt like eternity. He would stand a little closer to me than necessary, his eyes lingering a fraction of a second longer than they should, and I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. It wasn't that my husband wasn't trying. He was. He always had been. He'd ask how my day had gone, or if there was anything I needed, but there was something that had gone missing between us. I had stopped feeling like I mattered to him in the same way. I had stopped feeling the intimacy of those shared moments, those silent exchanges. The space between us had grown too wide, too vast, and every time I tried to close that gap, it felt like the distance only stretched further. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't. But I couldn't stop thinking about how alive I felt in those brief, stolen moments with the stranger behind the counter. I wanted more of it, more of the feeling of being seen, of being valued. I wanted to escape the suffocating quiet of my own home, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was able to do that. I knew I was walking a dangerous line. I knew that this was a slippery slope, one I should have stayed far away from. But as the days went on, the pull grew stronger, more insistent. Every time I told myself I should stop, something inside of me whispered that I couldn't, that I didn't want to. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but wonder, was I seeking comfort, or was I seeking something more? That night, as I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, I found myself staring at my reflection longer than usual. I didn't recognize the woman I was becoming. Who was this person, standing here with guilt and longing swirling inside her? What had happened to the woman who had once known exactly what she wanted, exactly who she was? And in the quiet of the room, I realized the terrifying truth. I didn't know anymore. I didn't know what I wanted, and I didn't know how to stop. But I couldn't stop myself from thinking of him, of his smile, of the way he made me feel, as though I mattered. The pull became unbearable. It wasn't just the little things anymore, the casual glances, the stolen moments. It was everything. Every time I walked into that cafe, I felt like I was stepping into a different version of myself, a version that was still uncertain, still searching, but also a version of me that felt seen, felt alive in a way that the other version, the wife, the partner, couldn't. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just a distraction, just an escape. But even I didn't believe that anymore. I couldn't. There were moments when I found myself replaying our conversations in my mind, analyzing each word, each pause. It was as though I was savoring the taste of something I knew I shouldn't have. And yet I couldn't stop. Each time I left that cafe, the ache in my chest grew a little heavier, a little deeper. I had begun to hate myself for it, for allowing this to happen. But the more I tried to push it away, the more persistent it became. I tried to tell myself it was a phase, that it would pass, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I had let something grow inside me that I couldn't control, and it was becoming harder to ignore. At home, things had grown cold. My husband was still the same. He came home every night, kissed me on the cheek, sat down for dinner, asked how my day had gone. But it was always the same conversation, always the same routine. I could tell he was trying, but it wasn't enough. He didn't see me the way he used to, and in turn, I couldn't see him the way I once had. He was trying to fill the space between us, but it was no use. The gap had widened too much. I had drifted too far away. The silence between us had become a suffocating thing, something I couldn't shake off, no matter how hard I tried. I could feel it every time we spoke, every time we were in the same room. We had become two strangers sharing a home. I could see the love in his eyes when he looked at me, but I couldn't feel it anymore. I had become numb to it, and it wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's fault but mine. And that's when I began to wonder, was it too late? Was I already too far gone to come back? Could I fix this? Or had I already ruined everything? I didn't have the answers. I didn't even know what I wanted anymore. I was lost in a sea of guilt and confusion. The part of me that still cared for my husband fought with the part of me that craved something new, something different. But what scared me more than anything was the truth I had started to realize. The more I gave in to that pull, the more I wanted it. The more I wanted him. I hated myself for it. I hated the way I felt. But there was something freeing about it too. A small part of me felt alive again, in a way that had nothing to do with my husband or the life we had built. It wasn't about love or passion. It was about feeling. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was more than just a role, more than just a wife. And as I sat in the quiet of my living room one evening, staring at the flickering light of the TV, I realized something else. I was beginning to fear that the more I went to him, the harder it would be to come back. I could feel the weight of the secret hanging over me like a storm cloud. I was living in two worlds now, one with my husband, where I still wore the mask of the perfect wife, and one with him, where I was just me. There was no middle ground, no easy way to reconcile the two, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down. But even then, I couldn't stop. I couldn't let go of the way he made me feel, of the way he looked at me like I was something more than a woman stuck in a routine. Even though I knew it was wrong, even though I knew I was breaking something that couldn't be fixed, I still went back. Each time, I told myself it would be the last, but it never was. And then one day, when I walked into the cafe and saw him standing there, waiting for me with that smile, everything changed. For the first time, I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't deny what was happening. There was no going back. I had already stepped too far into this world of secrets, of lies, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. But for now, all I could do was take another step forward and let myself fall a little deeper into the pull. The cafe felt different today, not in any way that was immediately obvious, but in the quiet that seemed to hang in the air as soon as I walked through the door. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was the weight of everything I was hiding, of everything I was becoming. But it felt too real now, too dangerous. I could no longer deny that I was standing at the edge of something that would change everything. I didn't know what I expected when I walked in, but when I saw him, I felt a tightening in my chest. His eyes met mine across the room, and for a brief second, it felt like time stood still. That instant, that look was so much more than I had been prepared for. It wasn't just the familiarity of our interactions anymore. It wasn't just the way he had listen to me, or the way he made me feel noticed. It was something else entirely. He knew. Somewhere deep down, I knew he could see me. He wasn't just seeing the woman who came in for coffee. He saw the cracks, the part of me that was hungry for something more, for something I couldn't find in the life I had built. And in his gaze, there was a quiet understanding, as though he had always known, even before I admitted it to myself. I walked toward him slowly, almost hesitantly. His smile was still there, soft and warm, but there was something different about it today. A subtle shift, something that suggested he knew more than I was willing to acknowledge. And the realization made my pulse race, my thoughts scatter. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I was suddenly aware of the trembling in my hands, of the way the space between us felt both impossibly small and dangerously wide at the same time. "Hey," he replied, his tone a little lower than usual. "You seem different today." I laughed, but it was hollow. He could see through me, couldn't he? The tension in my chest made it hard to breathe, and I had to force myself to focus on his words. "I guess I'm just tired." He didn't buy it. I could tell by the way his brow furrowed slightly, the way his gaze lingered on me with that knowing look. "You don't look tired. You look like you're carrying something heavy." I felt my breath catch in my throat. He was right. I was carrying something heavy, a secret, a choice I hadn't made yet, but that I could feel creeping closer, pressing against me like an invisible weight. Every step I took toward him, every moment I spent with him, was one step further away from the life I had built. I had always believed I was in control. I had told myself I could stop anytime, that I could go back to the way things were, to the life I had with my husband. But that was a lie. I had already crossed a line. And now, the question wasn't if things would change, but how. I tried to smile back at him, but it felt like a lie, an effort to mask the truth that had already begun to crack open inside me. "I'm fine. Really," I said, but my words felt empty. He handed me the coffee, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary. I froze, feeling the heat of his touch ripple through me, igniting something I had been trying to ignore. It was too much. It had always been too much. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his voice softer now. "You don't seem fine. You seem distant." I swallowed hard, trying to push away the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The truth was that I wasn't fine. Not even close. But how could I say that? How could I explain the battle happening inside me? How could I admit that I was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down at the possibility of everything I had built crumbling beneath me? I began, but the words caught in my throat. How could I finish that sentence? How could I tell him that I was more lost than I had ever been? That I was standing at the edge of something that felt as though it could destroy everything. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. He reached out, then, his hand resting on mine. And for the briefest of moments, everything else in the world disappeared. There was only the two of us, standing in that tiny cafe, in that moment of quiet understanding. I could feel the weight of his touch on my skin, a promise, a silent invitation to step further into this world we had been creating. And as much as I wanted to pull away, to step back and pretend that nothing had changed, I found myself unable to move. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said softly, his thumb brushing across my skin in slow, deliberate motions. "But I can't help but wonder if you're okay. Really okay." I wanted to tell him everything, to confess the truth, to admit the turmoil inside me. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not when I still didn't know what it all meant, what we meant. I felt myself leaning in just a little closer, drawn to him in a way that scared me more than I was willing to admit. And in that moment, I realized I had already made my choice. There was no turning back now. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, and as I stood there, with his touch still lingering on my skin, I knew that the life I had known, the one I had carefully constructed with my husband, was slipping further away. I had crossed the point of no return, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. "Thanks for the coffee," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking away from something, from someone, and towards something I couldn't yet fully understand. The days after that encounter felt like a blur, a haze of confusion and dread hanging over me. I could feel the tension rising with each passing moment, thickening the air in every room I walked into. My heart was heavy, with a secret I couldn't hide any longer, no matter how hard I tried. The weight of what I had done, what I had allowed myself to feel, pressed against me with a force I hadn't anticipated. I told myself I would pull back, that I would regain control. I convinced myself that I could fix things at home, that I could go back to the woman I had once been, the woman who loved her husband and had made promises to him that I swore I would keep. But the truth was undeniable. There was no going back. Not now. I hadn't seen him since that day in the cafe. There were no accidental run-ins, no casual chats. We had crossed a line, and I was both relieved and terrified by the silence that followed. The absence of him left a void inside me that I couldn't fill. The longer I stayed away, the more I realized how deeply I had become entwined in this other life, the life I couldn't bring myself to walk away from, no matter how many times I tried to convince myself it was wrong. At home, things were colder than ever. My husband could sense it too. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the distance between us, like an invisible wall that had grown higher and thicker with each passing day. He tried. I knew he did. He would make small gestures, buy me flowers, offer me a hug after a long day. But it was all too little, too late. I couldn't force myself to care in the way I used to. The part of me that had once loved him with all my heart was slowly fading into the background, overshadowed by something I couldn't explain, something that terrified me. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I felt the space between us more acutely than ever. I couldn't even remember the last time we had made love, the last time I had felt anything close to that connection with him. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and that, perhaps, was the greatest loss. I turned over, facing the dark window. The quiet of the room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I could hear my husband's steady breathing beside me, but it felt as though we were in different worlds entirely. My mind kept wandering back to him, the man from the cafe, his eyes, his smile, his touch. I knew I was in trouble, knew I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't control. And then the phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't need to look at it to know who it was. I felt a surge of guilt and longing flood through me all at once. My heart raced as I picked up the phone, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. The message was simple, but it hit me like a jolt of electricity. "Are you okay?" I sat up, the weight of the words pressing down on me. He didn't ask me anything complicated. He didn't demand answers. He simply asked if I was okay, and in that moment, I realized how much I needed to hear those words. How much I had been craving someone to ask me that, to care enough to wonder. I stared at the message for a long time, torn between the fear of what I might say and the overwhelming urge to respond, to reach out. I knew this was dangerous. I knew this was crossing a line I had no business crossing. But the part of me that still longed for something, anything outside of the life I was suffocating in, couldn't stop. I typed out a response, my fingers moving quickly over the screen. Not really. It felt like a confession, a small surrender. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to feel seen, to feel like I mattered. I needed to feel something. The reply came almost instantly. I miss you. Those words hit me harder than I expected. They seemed so simple, so innocent, but in that moment, they carried a weight that almost broke me. I could feel the floodgates of my emotions threatening to open, the guilt, the fear, the longing, all of it pouring over me. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for me to make a decision, my husband stirred beside me, his arm reaching out in his sleep to touch my back. I flinched slightly, the contrast between the warmth of his touch and the coldness that had settled in my chest, making it feel almost like a stranger's hand. The phone buzzed again. Are you alone? I couldn't lie. Not to myself. Anyway, I knew I wasn't. Not really. Not when my heart was divided between two lives. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity before I typed back, my hands trembling. Yes. And as the words left my fingertips, I knew there was no turning back. Not now. I had made my choice. And with each message, with each moment spent lingering in this secret, I was inching closer to a truth I wasn't ready to face. My husband shifted beside me again, and I could feel the pressure of his breath on my neck. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know how to fix this, how to make it right. And yet, here I was, the woman who had once believed in love and loyalty, now standing at the edge of something dangerous, something I couldn't control. I could feel it all slipping away, and I had no idea how to stop it. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and guilt. I couldn't focus on anything without feeling like I was walking a tightrope, suspended between two worlds. The life I had with my husband felt like a distant memory now, a shadow of what it once was. And yet, the life I was beginning to build in secret, in the quiet corners of my heart, felt fragile. It felt like something that could collapse under its own weight at any moment. I couldn't stop thinking about him. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he made me feel, the way he saw me, not as the dutiful wife or the woman who had been a part of something predictable, but as someone new, someone alive. And that was the problem. The more I let myself feel that, the more I realized that I was losing pieces of myself that I couldn't get back. But I couldn't stop. The pull was too strong, too consuming. Each message, each brief exchange, was like a spark that ignited something deep inside me. And it scared me more than I was willing to admit. At home, my husband grew quieter. He could sense something was wrong. I saw the questions in his eyes when he looked at me, the concern that was beginning to edge into his every word. He didn't know why I was slipping away from him, why I seemed so distant, and I couldn't tell him. I couldn't explain that I was already somewhere else with someone else, at least not in the way he would understand. The house was no longer a home. It was a cage. The walls seemed to close in tighter each day, and the silence between us became unbearable. I could hear him trying to reach out to me, but the distance between us was too great. The love we had shared seemed to have evaporated, leaving only a cold shell of what had once been. And it hurt. It hurt more than I was willing to admit. But then, one evening, as I sat in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea, my phone buzzed again. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. I had come to expect it. The messages were almost a comfort now, a lifeline that kept me from drowning in the emptiness I felt at home. I picked up the phone, my heart racing. This time, the message was different. We need to talk. Just those 4 words. Simple, yet loaded with meaning. And I knew, in that instant, that everything. I set the phone down slowly, feeling the familiar rush of panic and excitement in equal measure. It was happening. The reckoning I had been avoiding, the truth that had been hanging over me like a storm cloud, was finally upon me, and no matter how hard I tried to deny it, I couldn't escape what was coming. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to face this. I couldn't keep running. But as I stood up and walked to the door, I realized that the door I was about to open was one that I might never be able to close again. My husband was in the living room, watching TV. He looked up when I entered, his eyes searching mine for answers. But I didn't have any to give him. Not yet. Not in the way he wanted. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, but I couldn't bear to meet it. Not now. Not when I was so close to breaking everything. "I'm going out," I said, my voice a little too sharp. He looked at me, his brow furrowing in concern. "Where are you going?" "I'll be back later," I replied, avoiding his eyes. His lips parted as if to ask more, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, his expression unreadable. I hated myself for this. I hated how easily I had become a stranger to him, but there was no turning back. I walked out of the house, my steps hurried, my mind racing. I didn't know what to expect when I saw him, when I faced the consequences of everything I had allowed to happen. But I couldn't stop. I was already too far gone, and the truth, however painful, was something I had to confront. The drive felt endless, each mile a reminder of what I had done, of the life I had been betraying. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I couldn't release my hold. The closer I got to the cafe, the more my chest tightened, the more my thoughts spun out of control. And when I arrived, he was already there, waiting for me. He was sitting at the same table we had shared so many times before, but today it felt different. He looked up as I approached, and for the first time, I saw something raw in his eyes, something that mirrored my own fear, my own uncertainty. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was ready at all. But I couldn't walk away now. I had crossed a point of no return, and the only thing left to do was face the truth of what had happened between us. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," I said, my voice breaking just slightly. "I'm so lost." He reached for my hand across the table, his touch warm but hesitant. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he said softly. "But you do have to face it. You have to face what you really want." I squeezed his hand, feeling a rush of emotion. My heart ached as I realized just how much I had let slip through my fingers, how much I had sacrificed in this pursuit of something I couldn't even define. "I don't know what I want anymore," I whispered. "But I know I can't keep living like this. Not like I have been." The weight of my confession hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of everything I had done, everything I had allowed to unfold. There was no going back, no easy way out. The only thing left to do was move forward, even if I didn't know where that path would lead. And in that moment, I realized that the life I had built, the one I had thought was safe, was already gone. The woman I had been, the wife, the partner, was slipping away with each passing day. And no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I was no longer the same person. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. My heart beat in fits, each thud a reminder of the choices I had made and the mess I had created. The weight of it was crushing, but it was no longer just a quiet ache in the background of my life. It was loud now. It rang in my ears, followed me everywhere I went. It was in every glance from my husband, in every passing moment, when I realized how far I had drifted from the person I once was. The conversation in the cafe had changed everything. In that one moment, with his hand in mine and his eyes filled with a quiet understanding, I had allowed myself to fully admit what I had been avoiding for so long. I had crossed a line. There was no taking it back. But even now, as I lay in bed at night, my mind racing, I still didn't know what I wanted. The question hung there, suspended in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. I had always believed that I knew who I was, that I knew the path I was supposed to walk. But now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't even look at my husband without feeling the sharp sting of guilt. He was a good man, too good for me, in fact. And yet I had betrayed him. Every smile he gave me, every gesture of love, felt like a cruel reminder of the lie I was living. He deserved more than this. He deserved to be loved fully, without the shadow of my secrets hanging over us. But how could I tell him the truth? How could I explain the darkness I had let slip into my heart? How could I explain that I had found something in someone else that I couldn't seem to find with him? It felt like a betrayal of not just him, but of the very vows I had made. I thought back to the last time we had tried to connect, tried to make love like we used to. It had been an awkward attempt, filled with unspoken tension and a sense of distance that neither of us could bridge. His touch had felt distant, unfamiliar, and I had felt like a stranger in my own skin. But with him, in the cafe, it had been different. It wasn't just the physical pull between us. It was something deeper. He saw me. He really saw me. In that moment, he didn't just see the wife, the woman who had been pretending. He saw the woman who was lost, the woman who was struggling to reconcile the parts of herself that had been buried for so long. But that didn't make it right. It didn't change the fact that I was still married. It didn't change the fact that I had made promises that I had broken. I couldn't avoid the consequences forever. One evening, my husband came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. He stood in the doorway, watching me for a moment before he spoke. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy, with something I couldn't quite place. My stomach tightened. I knew what was coming. I had seen the way his eyes followed me, the way he had tried to reach me. He knew something was wrong. He had to, and I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I turned, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "What about?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with the weight of whatever was on his mind. "I think we both know what's going on, don't we?" His words hit me like a slap, and I froze, unable to speak. The guilt surged, sharp and painful. He had known. All this time, he had sensed it. But how could I face him now? How could I face the man who had loved me when I had so thoroughly betrayed him? "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words coming out like a plea. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this." He didn't speak for a long time. The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken emotions. And when he finally did speak, his voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my heart lurch in my chest. "You don't have to apologize," he said softly. "But I think we both know that I can't keep pretending either." I looked at him, trying to gauge what he meant, but I couldn't decipher it. His face was unreadable, and I wondered if he was holding back, trying to protect me from something he couldn't express. Or maybe he was holding back for his own sake, because he wasn't sure how to let go of everything we had built. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He met my gaze, his eyes searching mine as though trying to find the truth behind my question. After a moment, he nodded, a small, sad smile pulling at his lips. "I think it might be." And in that moment, I felt the entire foundation of my life crack beneath me. It wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of everything I had known. The life I had so carefully constructed was now shattered, and I had no idea how to pick up the pieces. The weight of the decision pressed down on me, suffocating me. I had chosen this. I had chosen to step away from the love I had once felt, and now there was nothing left to hold on to. My husband wasn't angry, not in the way I expected. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a quiet acceptance of the fact that we had both lost something we couldn't get back. I didn't know what came next. All I knew was that I was standing at the edge of something new, a new life, a new reality, and with it, the consequences of everything I had done. And I couldn't help but wonder if I was truly ready for what was coming. The days after the conversation with my husband felt like walking through a fog. Each step was uncertain, each breath heavier than the last. It was over, my marriage, my past, the life I had once known. All of it was crumbling before me, and I was left standing in the ruins of my choices. I spent days in silence, processing everything, the quiet moments with my husband. The way he had simply accepted the truth without lashing out had left me rattled. I had expected anger, bitterness, maybe even hatred, but instead there was only a quiet resignation in his eyes. He had known for longer than I had realized. He had seen the signs, felt the distance between us before I had even admitted it to myself. I had deceived him, and yet he had still loved me enough to let go. It wasn't easy, though. There were no easy answers, no easy paths to walk. I had torn apart a life I had promised to protect, and in doing so, I had shattered more than just my marriage. I couldn't go back. I knew that now. I couldn't pretend I was the woman I had been. I couldn't ignore the fact that I had changed in ways I wasn't ready to confront. And even though I had allowed myself to get caught up in something that felt like an escape, I could not deny that. In the weeks that followed, I found myself alone, physically, emotionally, in every way. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. It wasn't just the absence of my husband. It was the absence of everything I had once believed in. The walls closed in on me, and then, one evening, I received a message. I hadn't heard from him, the man from the cafe, in days. I wasn't sure what I expected, but the message was simple, and it sent a chill down my spine. I miss you. That familiar longing surged in me once more. I closed my eyes, feeling the pull of something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The temptation to fall back into the comfort of something I had built in secret, something that could take me away from the mess I had created, was strong. It was so easy to reach out to him and pretend like I hadn't just destroyed my life. But the truth was, I had already lost too much. I wasn't ready for more complications. I wasn't ready to lose myself entirely. I sat there for a long time, my fingers hovering over the screen, unsure of what to say, whether I should say anything at all. But finally, I responded, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed out the words. I think it's best if we don't talk anymore. I pressed send, and a weight lifted off my chest, though it was heavy with sadness. It wasn't closure, not really, but it was a decision. It was a step forward, and it felt like the only one I could. I placed the phone down, staring at the empty room around me. The quiet, the stillness, both of them were now companions I had no choice but to learn to live with. My world had been torn apart, and now I was left to rebuild it piece by piece. But how? Where did I even begin? I didn't have the answers. I wasn't even sure I wanted them. But I knew one thing, my journey was far from over. And whatever came next, I would have. It's been months now since I sent that message, since I made that final decision to cut ties and to stop running from the consequences of what I had done. Life has continued, in ways I didn't expect, in ways I still don't fully understand. The house is still too quiet, too empty, but it's no longer suffocating me. I've found some peace. It's not the kind of peace that erases the mistakes or fixes the brokenness, but it's a kind of quiet that comes with acceptance. I have learned to live with the guilt, the regret, and the ache of what I've lost. But I've also learned that sometimes accepting what you've done is the first step toward healing. I've seen my husband once since that day. He's moving on, too, though it's hard to know where he stands. He's kind as he always was, but there's something different in his eyes. A calmness that comes with the understanding that things can't be undone. As for me, I've taken small steps back into the world I had shut myself out of for so long. I've spent time with friends, rebuilt old connections, and learned to be okay with being alone. There's something strange about being alone, but in a way, it's freeing. I'm no longer pretending to be someone I'm not. And though I haven't reached a place of full forgiveness, either for myself or for what I've done to others, I know that I'm on a long road of growth. It's a road I'll walk alone, for now. But one day, I hope I'll find a way to forgive myself. Perhaps, in time, I'll understand that the person I was before was always just a part of me, a part that I needed to outgrow in order to become someone else, someone better. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, and it doesn't mean I won't look back on what I had with sadness, because I will. But for now, I live with the knowledge that I made a choice, and that choice has led me here, to this quiet, to this peace, to the slow but steady process of rebuilding. And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough.